All right, so we're live. Welcome to Agile Ventures and Craft Academy. And today we have a guest with us, a very prominent guest. We have David Heinemeier Hansson with us to talk to us a little bit about Rails. We're very happy to have you here. David, how are you doing?
Good, good. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So my name is Thomas, and I have with me Sam. Sam and I are a little bit of the guys behind this community. And Sam, would you like to welcome David and just tell him a little bit about us, and then we can move on to some questions and answers.
Yeah, David, welcome. We are a community of learners and learning specifically by working with code and doing it for charities around the world. So we get together groups of people online and hang out similar to this, and very often it's Ruby on Rails. I mean, good 80–90% of our projects is all Ruby on Rails that we're using to prototype software for other charities and deserving causes around the world, and getting lots of folks. We've got lots of our members here who've contributed, pull requests through GitHub on Ruby on Rails projects to help loads of folks. So having Ruby on Rails has been fantastic, and we're really enjoying the community. And thanks for joining us here today.
Absolutely, sounds great. That's an awesome cause to have your technology used as part of.
So David, all of our projects are open source projects, and since Rails is an open source framework, could you tell us a little bit about how it is to manage a large scale open source project for so many years as you have, and to tell us a little bit briefly about your workflow and the challenges and the opportunities that comes with it?
Sure. It's definitely been an interesting ride. I mean, when we started with Ruby on Rails I started talking about it publicly back in 2003, and the framework was released in 2004. It was in some ways easier perhaps, and in many ways also a lot harder. The ways it was easier was the community was a lot smaller. So the range of input and feedback that you got on certain topics just was more contained. It was more likely that you simply by name knew everyone that was in the community because it was tiny. I mean, there was, when I got started, the Ruby Talk list was probably the main community hangout point. I showed up at the first RubyConf in, I think 2003 or 2004, I think, where we were, 18 people or something. And when people asked, like, how many get to work with Ruby professionally, we were 2 people raising our hands. Things have certainly changed a lot since then. And things have gotten also easier with technology. I think GitHub is certainly the most important piece of the workflow in terms of processing contributions to the Rails core code base. And we've built up over the years of organization to sort of manage that. Because one of the things which was true in the early days was I just did all the reviews and I personally vetted all the pull requests. The pull requests came by email or on the wiki back in those days. There were a lot fewer of them, and that sort of kind of maybe worked when it was a tiny community and you were flying things one by one. It certainly doesn't work today. I mean, we have every month we get hundreds of new tickets and hundreds of new pull requests, and just a ton of people are contributing to the system, which means that you have to have a lot of people on the other side to actually process all that and give good feedback and give guidance to it, and ultimately merge the requests and tailor them as needed. But all that works in much the same way as I think you described that you guys are working. We're all distributed in the Rails team. There's the Rails core team, which hails from, I don't know, 8 different countries, I think. And then beyond that, there's the contributor teams and committed teams that work as well, and like we're all just spread out all over. Our main mode of organization is GitHub, as I said, and then we use Basecamp to coordinate. In addition, we have some chat rooms and so on, and I think that's been perhaps one of the lessons that I've taken in the early days. Everything just happened in IRC, where everything was public to all, or it happened on the mailing list where everything was public to all. And I think as communities grow and as the groups that organize them grow, having everything happen in the sort of bright operating room lights of public mailing lists and IRC just proved to be not productive. So we found that there's a fair amount of productivity for us, and not just productivity, but also sense of privacy and camaraderie that comes from having smaller groups that work together over a long period of time and kind of stand together against the sort of onslaught of feedback that you will get on major open source projects. Because, I mean, it's both the wonder and the dread of open source is that everyone everywhere can and will give you feedback. And lots of wonderful things come of that. The majority of new code in Rails comes from that, just someone finding something that they need to do. But we also get the negative side of that, which is people just discovered Ruby on Rails and then they want to give their more or less informed 2 cents about what they think about some certain aspect of the code base. And if all that feedback has to be processed in public by a single person all the time or a small group, that just gets tiring. So I've come to respect the need for tiered grouping, not in terms of status, but in terms of work contribution. If you look at the Rails core team list, lots of these people have been there for 7, 8, 9, 10 plus years working on the code base, and that stamina you can only really have when you feel like you have a group that has your back. So.
All right, thank you for that. Very, very, very good insights. I think that we can all learn from that. This is similar to our experience here in Agile Ventures. But without going into that too much, now that we have you here, David, what lies ahead for the framework in this year, but in the future? What's going on in Ruby on Rails? Having you here could give us a very, very valuable insight on what the things are to come in the future.
Sure. So I think in many ways, what's to come is more of what we've been fighting for all along. The challenges that Rails was up against and the other ecosystems that Rails was sort of compared to in the early days, it's kind of like we're getting a replay of a lot of that. In the early days, it was Java, it was J2E, it was the complexity of thousands of lines of XML configuration documents to set up application servers and what have you. And it was an environment where it was normal for people to spend several days just setting up the skeleton and setting up the sort of things before they could even start. Today, I think, unfortunately, we're regressing in some communities back to that state. If you talk JavaScript build systems and setups and configurations of frameworks and so on, I think there's a lot of similarities between the complexities that Java accumulated in the early 2000s and the complexities that JavaScript is now accumulating in our late 2010s. And that's not a great trend. And I think Rails has always tried to push back against that. Rails has always tried to be the sort of survival backpack for independent makers. That there's a lot happening now too with further specialization. Rails proudly pronounced itself to be a full stack framework back in the day, and individual developers took that label upon themselves to call themselves full stack developers, that they could create entire applications on their own. And I think that that's a wonderful ideal, not only an ideal, an actuality when you're developing with Ruby on Rails. But I think what we're seeing in a lot of other communities is that there's more of a stratification. You have the front-end developers focused on this end, you have back-end developers, you have more stratification of specialists. So to build anything meaningful, you have to have bigger and bigger teams, which just raises the cost and complexity of everything. And again, I don't think that's a good path. I think we should be going towards the easier. I think we should be making it ever easier for individual contributors or people working in teams, but sort of just that productivity that one person can build something from scratch. That should totally be possible and not be an insurmountable sort of obstacle. And I think there's a lot of other areas actually where the industry has moved forward and has made it easier. Like in the early days, sort of figuring out how to deploy a Rails app required some balancing. I mean, now between Heroku and AWS, it's become so much easier. So now not only can you be a full stack developer, you can also be a full stack developer and system administrator to some extent, simply because you can rely on these things. Anyway, we continue to sort of push back against complexity in all its forms. I think we're now in a resurgence of complexity in ways that we haven't really seen since back in those early 2000s days. And not only just a resurgence of complexity, but this false belief that this is what you have to do to build a modern web application. Unless you're going full React, full stack, single page application, you're not building modern web apps. That's a terrible, corrosive, negligent view of how you build applications and the value you can create by using simpler methods and simpler tools. It's not that these things don't have a place or there aren't certain applications that are tailored for it. It's just that there's such a broad span of applications that benefit far more from being done than being still 3 months out from setting up their fucking client MVC JavaScript rat hole. And that trade-off, I think, is often not being explicitly tackled when it's just assumed that the type of techniques you have to use today to build a web application in 2017 just requires that. There's simply nothing we can do. There are lots of techniques, there are lots of approaches that we can employ that are so much more productive and so much more in line with this notion of the full stack framework and the full stack developer. Turbolinks and other approaches on the JavaScript side and Rails in general, even if you didn't use any of those things, is not only sufficient, it's better than sufficient. The bar for web application is kind of stuck in this weird hole that either you think you have to do single page app, full-blown complexity, or you have to be sort of stuck in 2001 and still doing font tax or something. Like there's plenty of room in the middle between those two things where we embrace the elements of the web that really made it special and productive and easy for someone to make something. Yeah, okay, I could rant on this for hours and hours, so let's just park it there.
All right, thank you, David. Patrick, do you have a question for David?
Yeah, I added a few questions to the document there, Thomas. So let's see. Well, okay, I'll do with my first one, David. So again, thanks for joining us and talking to us about what's going on. Appreciate that very much. So David, back in the day when Rails version 1 came out, I poked around with it. I wasn't even doing software development back then, but I was curious. And what I really liked about version 1 was that there was an attempt to stay with 100% Ruby, soup to nuts, client to server, and there was a nice wrapper around Scriptaculous, which of course has been abandoned. But anyway, why was that approach abandoned? You know, keeping 100% Ruby, and do you have any thoughts about trying to get back to that goal in the future, or at least approach it?
Yep, I think that's a great point. And unfortunately, I think my answer is that the reason we went with a Ruby wrapper approach was that JavaScript back in those days was, first of all, was unavoidable. If you want to program the browser in interactive ways, you have to go through JavaScript at the final stage, right? But writing JavaScript directly was so painful that we felt like it needed an anesthetic. And that anesthetic was the Ruby wrappers. Thankfully, JavaScript has progressed immensely since then. I'd actually say it's a half-decent language now, better than a half-decent language. I've recently been writing a fair amount of JavaScript in ES6, which is actually quite good on a lot of levels. It's not Ruby, no, absolutely not. But the price that you pay to go through a sort of a compilation or translation step where you're trying to turn Ruby into JavaScript is significant. So the benefit has to be very significant as well. And I think the benefits have just vastly decreased over time. The JavaScript of 2017, thankfully, is not the JavaScript of 2006 or 7, right? Things have gotten so much better now that the value we get out of that translation step just is ever shrinking. And I think there are other factors playing in too. I've been bemoaning some of the tendencies in the JavaScript community, but there's also lots of great things going on. And the closer you are to sort of a shared dialect or shared language there, I think the easier it is to tap into the good parts and leave the bad parts behind, right? The more you are off in your own corner writing your own dialects, the harder things become. So I think this sort of went through phases. First, we went through it with a Ruby to JavaScript compilation step. Then we went through it with an embrace of CoffeeScript. And I think now we finally arrived just very recently, and a lot of these things that are making me feel like JavaScript is finally a great place to be. They're still in, I don't want to say concept stage, but they're still in proposal stage. They haven't even been adopted in the final standards yet. But I feel like we're just at the cusp now where JavaScript is more than good enough. And the value we can get out of going through these other steps, that window is closed. And I think the other thing I've at least prided myself on with Ruby on Rails is like, we're not sticking to any guns that aren't worth sticking to anymore. Things that made sense in 2004, but not in 2007 got dropped. Like when we first sort of started with Rails, like XML processing was a big deal. And we had all sorts of XML processing built into the core framework. And then JSON sort of just superseded that. And now, I don't know of anyone who's voluntarily writing XML to sort of talk between services and so on. Everything is JSON now. So things move on and you move on with it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't embrace things as they are when they are, right? Like, so we embraced CoffeeScript for a long time, and I still see lots of good things to it, but I can see the tide is turning. So, hey, you get to have you had to have 3 good years of XML processing being a thing, boom, it's gone. Then you get to have 3 good years of CoffeeScript translations, boom, then that's gone, right? If Rails wants to stay sort of with this and not just be a time capsule, then we have to sort of evolve with the progress that's being made, and sort of we bring the best of what we had from our foundation, which is actually mostly about principles and ideology to some extent. I wrote that up in the Rails doctrine, a lot of those thoughts that went into like, why is Rails the way it is? Because that's the guiding signals that will lead us to the future. The particular bits of technology, I don't care about that much. I mean, beyond some of the sort of basics, I care extremely deeply about Ruby and consider it still to be the absolute best programming language for the web in the ways that I want to use it. So there we go.
All right. Thank you. So when we talk about some principles and patterns, I have a question from one of our members in the document that we prepared for this meeting. What do you think about microservices pattern, and how can Rails fit in this new approach to build applications?
Yeah, yep, that's good. Good question. Maybe you guys can.
Before, I just wanted to ask you that.
Yep, absolutely. So my position on that point is that microservices is not a technical pattern as much as it is an organizational pattern. That larger organizations get to a certain point where they have independent teams, where those teams talking to each other is kind of like when companies talk to each other. That the inter-team communication processes are very much like the inter-company communication processes between smaller companies. And when you get to that stage, when your company is so large that talking to department one over is kind of like talking to a different company, you need a different way to interact technically. And microservices can be a way of doing that. I think the predominant example of that turning out well is Amazon. And I mean, that's a little bit of what is just service oriented architectures as sort of was the buzz a few years ago, and now the buzz is microservices. I think they're still operating in the same space, that you carve up your set of responsibilities, the thing your organization is trying to do, into smaller bits that independent teams can own. Now, that's the sunny side of it. I think the rainy side of it is that pattern makes sense for a handful of organizations, in my opinion. In the sort of grand scheme of things, it makes zero sense for the vast, vast majority of companies out there who do not have departments so large that talking between them is like companies talking to each other. Which is why I've long been a proponent and continue to double down on it whenever this comes up, on the majestic monolith. This idea that individual organizations that are not so large as to justify these inter-department patterns, they should double down on whole integrated systems that are easy to understand. Because when you are a Basecamp, for example, we're 50 people, we have a technical department of about 15 programmers. Every single one of those 15 programmers should have a pretty damn good understanding about how all of Basecamp works. We're simply not large enough, and Basecamp as an application is not large enough that it's impossible for anyone to understand a majority part of that application. And if that's your goal, if your goal is to have people who understand the entire thing, the whole application, then the sets of patterns that you're trying to employ is totally different. The whole idea behind microservices and service architecture in general is that no single person can understand the whole system, right? Like, that's why we split it up. That's why we give parts of it to teams and so on. But I think that that's a bankruptcy that some people have to declare on the size of their software. Most companies and most organizations, I hope, won't reach that point where they have to declare bankruptcy on the prospect of any individual contributors understanding the whole system. And when you are at that size and below, majestic monolith all the way, which is basically one system. Cut out all of the middle parts. Don't make extraneous HTTP connections back and forth where you have to deal with all sorts of nasty arrow states and retry logic and two-phase commits. And it's just another one of those complexity multipliers, in the same way that client-side MVC is a complexity multiplier, where you take the whole system and you make it dramatically harder to understand, reason about, and change, because you've separated that out to these individual parts. Again, when you reach the point that there is no other alternative, when no single group of people or whatever can understand the whole system, you must. Okay, accept the bankruptcy and get on with it. But like, it's kind of like going into business and then on the first day saying, oh, I'd like to declare bankruptcy. Like, what? What? You just got started, for Christ's sake. Like, how can you already be in a state of bankruptcy? Don't employ bankruptcy strategies to something just starting out. And I think that that's a pattern that plays out in many aspects of technology, is that we look to the giants, or lots of people do. They look to the Googles, the Facebooks, and so on, like, and then they think, what do they do? What's Facebook doing? Whatever Facebook is doing, let's do that. When usually the answer is exactly the opposite. Whatever Facebook is doing, do the opposite of what Facebook is doing. Because the constraints and the pressures that are on Facebook are just not at all yours. The complexity of running an organization of, I don't even know how many people they have, 20,000, 50,000, whatever it is, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, are completely different from running a team of 5 or a team of 15 or a team of 50.
All right, very, very interesting insight. Thank you for that. So, in Agile Ventures, we have a mixed variety of people. A lot of our members are junior programmers that recently started to learn to write software, and then quite often they choose Rails as their first framework. I usually say that Rails is like Texas Hold'em. It's easy to learn, but it takes a lifetime to master. And could you tell me, how it is, like some pointers to our juniors, how it is to grow with Rails as you progress in your career? Is Rails just a good starting framework, but can you also grow with it and build more advanced applications?
Yeah, so I think the way you summarize is exactly what we're trying to achieve, is that programming used to be very hard to get started. I tried to learn programming many times as I was growing up, and I failed several times learning it because it was just too goddamn hard. Because getting to the first point of seeing something on the screen that did something interesting, it was just too hard. And I think that that's where we really made huge strides as a community, especially building for the web, and certainly something in the Rails world we continue to focus on, is we've got to make it easy to get that first win, to get that first feeling of success as though you're making real software that does something meaningful. And we focus very hard on that. But on the same time, programming and making full-fledged applications, I mean, that's a career. It's not just like, you don't just learn how to flip the burgers, right? Like, it's very, very deep, and it gets deeper and it gets wider every single day, right? So that's why we have to continue to improve on sort of just how easy we make it to get started, because, I mean, you got to get started before you can even contemplate getting to a level of experthood. And I think to some extent, perhaps we've oversold it. And I'll take some responsibility for that, in the sense that the 15-minute videos and so on that Rails popularized on how easy it is to build a simple application perhaps gave the misconception that, like, oh, in 15 minutes you can learn everything there is to learn about building a blog. No, absolutely not. Like, that's going to take you months, if not years, if not decades, to truly get to a level of experthood. The wonderful thing is you don't need to be an expert to build applications. There are all sorts of applications at impressive amounts of scale that you can build and that can be valuable without you being an expert, even though it has many errors and it wasn't written with all the best practices and it won't scale to 10 billion people and blah, 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 blah. Most applications don't require that. Lots of applications are used by 20 people, 100 people, 1,000 people perhaps, and dealing with the pressures of 1,000 people on an application, like, that's never been easier, right? Like, you can write extremely inefficient, poor code and still deliver wonderful value to 1,000 people who have to use an application, where it's so much better than the alternatives they otherwise had of writing things down on paper or using a large Excel spreadsheet that they were passing around, or any of these other things, right? So take solace in that fact that even if you're a shitty programmer writing shitty code, it can still produce wonderful programs that help real people all over, right? And again, this is just a journey. Everyone starts out being a shitty programmer writing shitty code. Like, there's no way to jump over that step. I mean, that is literally like the engraving on step one, that you must write shitty code and you must be a shitty programmer. The wonderful thing is you don't have to stop there, right? You can keep walking. And as you go along, you'll get better, and you'll write only marginally crappy code, and then you'll write passable code, and then at some point you'll write code where you go like, wow, this is really nice. I really like this, right? And that takes a long time. I mean, I've been writing Ruby code for 15 years, and I continue to pick up new ways and patterns and ideas about what good code is. And then I look at code from a few years past and go like, I wish I wrote that differently or whatever. It never stops, which is wonderful, right? Like, otherwise we'd get bored as hell. If you could learn everything there is to learn about this whole profession in 3 months in a code school, I mean, how shallow would the whole thing be? It would be as shallow as learning how to operate the fryer at McDonald's and flip burgers, right? Like, that's the appeal. The appeal is that there is this step. So to the final question, like, can Rails be with you for that whole path? Absolutely. I mean, that's the wonderful thing of having been around for 15 years, is that it's not even an argument anymore. It's just a matter of pointing to URLs. Oh, have you heard of Airbnb? Have you heard of GitHub? Have you heard of Shopify? Have you heard of Basecamp? Have you heard of Twitch? So, I mean, that's to many extents like that. You get that benefit simply from just sticking around, right? Because you can say the same thing about any of the major dominant platforms like PHP or C# or Java or whatever. Like, anything that's been around and hung around long enough and then reached that critical mass of users can point to very real applications. Because the fact of the matter is, you can write real applications in anything. Every single modern programming language and framework today can be built to create anything. So it's kind of a little bit of, I think, a misnomer, and I don't know, an appealing one, I suppose, when you're first starting out, like, which one is the best one? There is no such answer. It's the best one for you, the best one that appeals to you. Not even the best tool for the job, because I fucking hate that saying too. because that assumes sort of some overall objective truth about compatibility between certain tools and certain jobs, which is completely hogwash and non-existent. The best tool for the job is the tool that you find inspires you most to become a better programmer and dig deeper. The differences between a motivated programmer who's really into their domain, working with the shittiest tools you can imagine, and the unmotivated programmer not into the domain, working with the so-called best tools, I take the former every single time.
All right. Okay, so just one final question to you, David, before you have to go. Our 30 minutes are up already, but what keeps you going? What keeps you motivated? Why are you still around? You're a successful businessman. You have a rich life, yet you're still involved in this community. What is your motivator, and how long will you stick around? What are your plans?
Sure. So it's really easy. Programming is one of my favorite things to do in life. It just so happens that it also coincides nicely with being what I get to do for work, and it also coincides nicely with the availability of this hobby and being involved with the Rails community. And since programming is one of my favorite things to do, and Ruby is my favorite way to program, like, as long as those two statements are true, I will continue to be programming in Ruby. And as long as I'm programming in Ruby, I will spot new things and new ways to do my job and my interest. And I'll create new frameworks and new solutions and new extensions to Rails. That's how I've been in the Ruby community for the past almost 15 years. And I hope to be there for another 15 years. If in 5 years, something else should come along that entices me better than Ruby or even than Rails, wonderful. Then we move on to that. I have no sort of otherwise allegiance to what I started with. I'm simply still with Ruby and still with Rails because I perceive that for me, those are the best answers. And I look at all the answers. I consume in perhaps unhealthy at times amount of technical information and write-ups and approaches and all sorts of new ideas. And there's lots to learn every single day. And I've so far come to the conclusion that for the things that I care about and the applications that I care about building, this combination of Ruby and Rails continues to be the most appealing one, in concert with others. As I said, I've recently dug in and done a lot of JavaScript work, and that's great too. But sort of the centerpiece remains Ruby and remains Rails. And I hope to continue to do that for as long as I can type and see the code that I'm typing, or I don't know, maybe we'll get to some point where we're imagining code and that comes up. That'll be fun too. But it's one of those things, as in, if you're a writer, people generally don't ask like, so when have you written your last words, right? Like usually when you're dead, right? I mean, so whenever I've written my last piece of code, well, when I'm dead. So let's see.
All right, thank you very much for that. So that kind of concludes our session. Again, David, thank you very much for taking the time. Do you have any questions to us at this point?
No, I'd encourage you to keep on. I know that one of the thoughts that came up or questions in some of the initial emails back and forth was whether we need to jump on like all these more complicated way of building applications, like using single page application patterns and so on. And I just encourage you to look at like, why are you building what you're building and who are you helping? Do those people care whether it has the latest JavaScript buzzword attached to it? If not, then maybe that's not worth your time. I mean, they still be worth your time because you're personally interested in learning it, but don't feel pressured because you're reading Hacker News or some other outlet or echo chamber that's reverberating the same sort of mantra over and over again. Those things change every 5 minutes. Like, I mean, I've only been sort of involved with programming to some extent for about 20 years, and I've already seen like so many of the same sort of things come and go all the time. Focus on the fundamentals, focus on the basics, and sort of deliver the value in the fastest, cheapest way that you can.
I love it. That's exactly what I usually tell my students, and I try to live by myself. So keep it simple, stupid. You know, just do the least, write the least amount of code and deliver the biggest value. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
All right, David. Again, thank you very much. And if there's, you know, if you ever have a chance to, or urge to visit us again, you're always welcome. And you know,
Thanks.
let's. All
Appreciate
right.
it. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.